Hey, good morning, guys. We're going to continue this week in our series on the Hall of Faith. So if you've looked at Hebrews 11 at all, the writer of Hebrews kind of lists these men that are serves as models for righteousness, which is interesting when you consider what we're going to talk about today. But if you followed along the last 2 weeks, so 2 weeks ago we looked specifically at what happens when Joseph finds himself in a situation where he can either pay his brothers back with revenge or he can forgive them, and how he serves as a model for the forgiveness we have in Christ. And then last week, we looked at Gideon and sort of what happens when we find ourselves in unfortunate or really disadvantageous circumstances, and how that might not be a bad thing, that really may be the Lord's doing for his glory and so that he is made much of. And then this week we're going to look at Samson. Now, I just go ahead and tell you that this is not a good story. I don't read this story and leave encouraged. I'm really curious, if I'm the writer of Hebrews, why I put Samson in a list with Noah and with Joseph and with Gideon and people like that, because there's not a lot about Samson's life besides the way that the Lord uses him that I would use as a model for my own. And I don't, so I can't pretend to know why he got in that list, but I can tell you that it's in the Bible, and there's things to be learned from it, and that he's an example for a lot of things that unfortunately we all resonate with. And so maybe he's there just as an example of how the Lord will use us, despite some of our fatal flaws and some of the things that we do regularly with contention against the Lord. And so if you know anything about Samson, he's like one of the cute little Bible stories you read if you grew up in the church. If you didn't, you've probably heard about him. But he's one of those cute Bible stories that you read next to Noah and next to some of the the Red Sea, like all these cute Bible stories that actually are pretty horrific if you actually look at them. But we read them to our children as bedtime stories. Samson's one of those. So Samson, from a broad picture, he's a Nazarite, meaning his mother, when she was trying to get pregnant, committed him to the Lord. And the Nazaritic vow essentially says three things. If you read Judges 13, it says that A, you're never going to drink wine, right? Or strong drink, like you're not going to touch it. B, you're never going to cut your hair, right? Your hair can't get cut, which if you know anything about Samson is a big deal. And then 3, you're not supposed to touch or have any association to the dead. And so these 3 things serve as sort of a vow to the Lord that, hey, I'm going to commit my life to, his mom says, I'll commit my son's life to you if you'll give me a son. And so this is the vow made. Now Samson, in classic Samson, really male human fashion, broke all 3 of those vows, was the worst example of a Nazarite on the planet. But it's important to see that he was well aware of the vow that his mother made him to the Lord, and he's well aware that it was made to show commitment to God so that he might live a life faithfully serving the Lord, and that he broke all 3 of those, and yet the Lord still, despite that, decided to use him. And so what I want you to do, if you're following along, all of this shows up in Judges chapter 14. And so what I want to do is give you one point and then give you some takeaways. The big point is that Samson has a fatal flaw. And that fatal flaw is the same fatal flaw that each of us has. Right? The story of Samson, if we read it without any of the hard details, looks really awesome. Right? Samson is this strong stud of a man that's empowered by the Lord with long flowing locks, right? Think like Brad Pitt and Achilles. He's this stud of a man that just is empowered by the Lord and kills Philistines with ease. He kills a lion with his bare hands as he rips it in half, and eventually he eats honey from its carcass. Like, he's sort of this man's man. And eventually he's captured by the Philistines, and his final act of valor, he pulls the Philistine temple down on top of himself, killing 3,000 Philistines. Like, from an overarching view, man, this guy looks like a stud. But the reality is, if you read his story in detail, man, he's just like us. Like, I look at his story and my heart is convicted when I see the sin and the flaws that just wrecked his life. And so here's the truth. Here's the one point I want you to walk with. Samson's fatal flaw is his eyes, right? Which is a metaphor for his desire. His fatal flaw is his desire that he caves to regularly, right? And it is no different than the same fatal flaw we found in the Garden of Eden. What did it say in Genesis 3 that Adam and Eve, they looked at the fruit, and what does it say? It says it looked as a delight to their eyes, and it looked like it would be good to eat. It was their desire that drew them to the fruit. Not anything else. It was their desire. What draws me to sin? My desire. Sin feels good, right? Like nobody would be falling into sin or doing sin regularly if it didn't feel good. The reason sin is rampant in our lives, and the reason sin has wrecked this world is because it feels good in the moment, right? It feels good at that second. It is like satisfying just in a quick second, right? And then it fades and it falls and it leaves us empty. That is the flaw of Adam and Eve. That is the flaw of Samson. That is our flaw. If you read Samson's life, when you see his desire and his eyes show up in his story, it's always to his detriment. So if you read Judges 14, I'm just going to read some of this to you so you can kind of get a feel for this man, Samson. And most of you men who are listening to this are going to really be able to resonate with this guy, right? Samson went down to Timnah. This is Judges 14, verse 1. Samson went down to Timnah, and at Timnah he saw one of the daughters of the Philistines. What did he do? He desired one of the daughters of Timnah. So back up. Samson is a Israelite. He is a part of God's chosen people. What does he see? He sees a woman who is not part of God's chosen people. He would be committing himself, or he's chasing a woman that does not have the same belief system, that does not desire the Lord, that would ultimately drag him away from the Lord, right? And he sees her. He desires her. Right, saw one of the daughters of the Philistines. Then he came up and he told his father and mother, I saw one of the daughters of the Philistines at Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife. She is gorgeous. Get her for me. Right, his desire. But his father and his mother said to him, as good mom and dad should, is there not a woman among the daughters of your relatives or among all the people that you must go for an uncircumcised Philistine? Like, hey, choose somebody that loves the Lord. Choose somebody that's going to push you to the Lord. But Samson said to her father, get her for me. And here's what it says in verse 3. Get her for me, for she is right in my eyes. My desire. I desire her. And then in verse 4 it says, his father and mother did not know it was from the Lord, for he was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. At that time, the Philistines ruled over Israel. The Lord was using Samson's fatal flaw, his sin, which is not good, but he would use it later to ultimately to bring about redemption for Israel, right? And if you read verse 7 later on, it says, then he went down and talked with the woman. She was right in his eyes. That's example 1. If you go to verse 9, right, there's another time where it says that ultimately it was his desire that got him into trouble. I'm going to read verse 9 to you. He scraped it. So remember, what's the vow he committed? The Nazirite vow. It says he can't be associated to dead animals, right? Well, he kills a lion. He leaves the carcass. When he comes back by the carcass, a beehive has made itself a hive inside of the carcass, right? And so what does Samson do? He disregards the vow that says, I won't be associated to dead things. He disregarded the commitment made to the Lord, right? A vow made to the Lord, a serious commitment to the Lord. And in verse 9 it says, he scraped it out, the honey, out of the carcass into his hands and was eating it as he went. So he just disregarded the commitment made to the Lord, right? And just scraped this honey out of the carcass of this animal and started eating it, right? Why? His desire. He desired the honey, right? And disregarded the Lord in the process. Verse 16, or chapter 16 is his demise. We see him sort of chasing this woman, Delilah. Delilah is a Philistine. Inevitably, it is his desire for Delilah. If this were a movie, this would sort of be the rated R portion where he's just sort of sleeping with Delilah. And ultimately Delilah, as a Philistine, finds his like fatal weakness, his like where all of his strength comes from, and it's in his hair. And so she inevitably tells the Philistines, hey, if you cut his hair, he won't be strong anymore. Which again, Nazirite vow, don't cut your hair. He did. He gave her that information. Why? Because he desired Delilah. He was so infatuated with this lust for Delilah that he was willing to give away this secret that ultimately kept him strong. And then 16, essentially, his hair is cut. He's captured by the Philistines. And what's the very first thing they do? If you read chapter 16, verse 21, it says that they captured Samson and they gouged out his eyes. The very first thing they did was take away the thing that which ironically is sort of the symbolism of his desire. They gouged out his eyes. And then if you go on to 17, And you look at what happens with no eyes anymore, and he's chained. He's chained in this Philistine temple to the pillars in the middle of the temple, and they're making fun of him. They're using him as an example. They're ridiculing him, right? And with no eyes, he asks the Lord for help. So finally, with his eyes taken away, ironically, he finds himself in a place of humility before the Lord, right? And he asks the Lord for strength one more time. Now, an argument can be made that he did it for the Lord's glory, and also an argument can be made that he's doing it out of revenge. But he asks for the Lord's help, and he pulls those pillars down on top of himself, and in doing so kills 3,000 Philistines, right? The whole temple comes down. There's a whole lot going on there that I'm not going to try and get into. Was it revenge? Did the Lord work despite his vengeful attitude? Is this suicide, and is that okay because it is for the Lord's glory? There's so many things you could get into there. I'm gonna leave that to you and your commentaries and your Google searches. But ultimately, what happens here is, if you follow Samson's life, what you see is this serious flaw, his desire that just sort of has him under control the whole way through the story. He's never feels like he's in control of his desire, his lust. Right, his sin is in control of him. Big takeaways from Samson. One, Samson's not a paragon for virtue. Right, he's not an example of righteousness for us. He's an example of broken sin in a man's life, and how the Lord uses us despite our brokenness. Right, Samson is a model of just addiction to desire and addiction to sin, and yet the Lord uses him in a massive way to save Israel from the Philistines. Right? It comes at the cost of his life, right? Which is our second point in a second. But ultimately, Samson isn't somebody we look at and go, man, that's a man after God's own heart. That's David. No. He's an example of a man that is wrecked by sin perpetually throughout his whole life, and the desire he has for sin ultimately kills him. Right? And then the second point is that desire, when left unattended, is deadly. Right? Look at Samson's life. Desire, his eyes, his lust, his satiation for sin, when left unattended, is deadly. Romans 8:12-13 says that sin produces death. Romans 12:9 says that we are to hate, abhor is the word, abhor what is evil. Right? When we let desire run around in our hearts and our minds and in our lives, we let sin run around and leave it unattended. We don't confess it. We let it just continually and perpetually run our lives. Like in Samson's case, it will literally kill you. Right? It kills you spiritually. It kills your relationship with the Lord. It kills your relationship with others. It kills your desire for the Lord. And in some cases, it will actually kill you. Right? That's Romans 8:12, that sin produces death. Right, or actually kill you. John Owen says that if you either need to be killing sin, or it will be killing you. There is no middle ground. Sin is like a cancer. If you leave it unattended, it doesn't stay at phase 1. It grows to phase 4, and it wrecks your body. Right? And so I told you this was not an encouraging story. Then I read Samson, and my heart hurts because I see my own sin, and I see how sometimes I let it just run my life and let it just push me around, and I just fall trap to the desire of my heart and the desire of my eyes. And I see what it did to Samson, a man that was gifted beyond measure, and yet his own sin sort of kept him from fulfilling that potential, although the Lord used him in a big way regardless. And so the big takeaways I want you to take away is, one, Samson, though he was sinful, was still used by the Lord, but he's not an example to be followed, right? His desire, he just let run rampant in his life. I think when we look at our own lives, we can see some of that own sin and I can certainly see it in mine, that is just, we're letting it run rampant. We're not killing it. We're not confessing it. We're not attacking it with prayer. We're just letting it run rampant in our lives. And left unattended, it's the silent killer, right? It won't kill you in one day, but over the course of your life, it will grow like cancer, right? Especially left unattended, and it will kill you, right? It will ruin your life. So I know this isn't the most encouraging one, but my encouragement to you is to read the story of Samson and sort of feel the weight of that, right? When you read the small details and you read how awesome and how much power God gave him, right? And yet you see it ruined by his sin. I want you to feel the weight of that. I feel the weight of it. And apply that to your own life as you consider, man, where in my life am I letting sin just run around unattended? Love you guys. We'll talk next week.